Hello everyone. Hi. I think we're going to start now. If everyone could come as close forward as you can, that'd be really helpful. No pressure. Anyway, this is my first year at CPDP, and it's wonderful to be here. It's been an excellent event so far, and I'm really delighted and honoured to chair this panel on a matter very close to my heart, democracy and data. And it's very close to my heart because it's a topic on which I have two different professional hats. Firstly, I've written extensively on this issue. Most notably, I co-authored a report on this issue with Tactical Tech. We have Amber from Tactical Tech sat in the front row. And that was a report on data and democracy in the UK. And we explored in that report some of the key issues that we'll be discussing here today. And in that report, we showed how difficult it is to explain to the main consumers of this technology, the political parties, what role they play and how problematic misuse is. In fact, when I was talking to some parliamentary people about how data is used by their parties, it was a bit like showing a fish how to make pizza. They just had no idea that this was happening. Further, we explored the difficulty in finding out exactly what digital spending is. The regime in the UK to protect democracy is built on capping spending. But how do you know when money is spent on digital campaigning? It's inherently difficult to do so when invoicing is quite archaic. But owing to the incredible work of Tactical Tech, particularly Amber, we were able to dig into those invoices and explore what digital spending actually was over the last 3 electoral issues in the UK, so the last 2 elections and the referendum. And it was very clear the correlation between spend on digital and electoral success was really stark. It's needless to say, for example, the Leave campaign knew how to use digital and maximised its impact. Our report was issued before the Information Commissioner's report on a similar topic, and I'm glad to say the ICO echoed most of our recommendations. In particular, the ICO also expressed the need for a code of conduct on the use of data in campaigning, and the ICO issued a consultation which closed at the end of 2018, and we should expect the results to come at some stage soon. I think that's going to be a really important report as to how data should be used in democracy. My second hat is as a litigator. I'm a lawyer, and the case I'm probably most well known for is bringing the case against Cambridge Analytica. I'm sure it's a company that needs no introduction. It's a company that made worldwide news purely for the use of data in technology. And our case sought responsibility for such political micro-targeting that the company engaged in. And it resulted in a prosecution of the company, and we're currently putting pressure on the attempts to liquidate that company because there is such important democratic consequences to how that company closes. And that work also illustrates an increasing overlap between technology and constitutionality. In turn, there's an increasing interest in how, for example, the behavioral advertising ecosystem has been used and attempts to curb its successes. And this is particularly true in the political context. We've now seen how personal data was said to be the main difference in these seismic political events. And as our Electoral Commission has said, it's given rise to concerns that our democracy may be under threat. Furthermore, the Information Commissioner, when considering the interplay between technology and democracy, stated that she is deeply concerned this is happening without due legal or ethical consideration of the impacts on our democratic system. And despite that growing interest, this space is often misunderstood. And the issues we face are about more than one company, one claimant, or one political party. These are bipartisan matters of widespread public importance. And it's for that reason I'm really delighted to chair this panel. And I hope you join me in welcoming our panel and let them explore these issues in more depth. I'm going to hand over to Elonai, who's going to be your moderator for the afternoon.
Thanks, Ravi, and thanks Tactical Tech for organizing this. I'm Elonai Hickok from the Center for Internet and Society based in India. And you know, over the past day and a half, I think there have been a number of panels and discussions that have really dug into this topic, data and its use in elections. There have been concerns raised about the privacy of individuals, around practices such as micro-targeting, disinformation has been discussed, questions have been raised about the effectiveness of data protection, questions have been raised about the security of election processes. So I'm really excited for this panel to dig a little bit deeper and bring some more nuance to this very robust debate that's happening here at CPDP. Each panelist will have 10 minutes, and then after each presentation, I'll ask a question, and then After that, we're going to open it up to the floor for discussion and further debate. So we're going to start with Dr. Paul Bernal. Dr. Paul Bernal is a senior lecturer at the Information Technology, Intellectual Property Media Law at the University of East Anglia, and specializes in internet privacy and related rights, and he will be sharing examples and insights from elections in the UK.
Great, thanks. There's a mic by you, I think. Or there's a roving one there.
There's a roving one, great. Hi, can you hear me? Yeah. I'm really happy to be here for lots of reasons. This is a subject I've been thinking about for a very long time, and what's interesting to me is how much our thinking about it has changed over the years. And I think in some ways that reflects the thinking about data in general and about privacy in general and about how it fits into the rest of things. But I want to start by saying, first of all, that we haven't really set out what the problem is. And as academics, we like to say, well, what is this problem? So if we're going to solve something, we've got to know what the problem is. And our problem has been that we haven't thought of it as a problem for that long. And when I was thinking back to when I first started thinking about data and elections, it was Obama. And everyone in my field was rather admiring of Obama. He won because he was smart in how he used data. He was able to take advantage of the high tech and be more with it and more up to date and so on. And we liked that. We all thought this was a good thing. Now we come to Trump, and it's clearly evil and undermining democracy and all of this. Is it true that it's different now than it was then? Yes. Is it also true that people have a tendency to like Obama and dislike Trump, so are more likely to like what Obama did than they are to like what Trump did? Also, probably yes. But both attitudes disguise kind of the underlying problem. We want to use data. In general, most people involved in this field are kind of slightly geeky, generally interested in tech and so on. We like it. We like to be smart, and I mean smart in a real way, not smart in smart cities, but we don't like to be creepy. We don't like to be sinister. And the question we have to ask is, when does the use of data shift from being a smart and positive thing to being a creepy and sinister thing? And can we actually draw a line somewhere that says, beyond this, that's creepy and bad. Before this, it's smart and good. If we can't draw the line, then we're in real trouble, because what we have to do is say, okay, let's get rid of the good stuff as well, stop all the good processing of data, what we used to think of as a positive thing, if we're going to have any chance of dealing with the sinister stuff. But when you think about it in those terms, you have to look at actually why this data is so tempting. And when I look at what's happened in the UK, I've come up with a number of examples that have shown quite how much politicians, though they don't actually understand very much of what's going on, they like it. They want to be able to do it. And a few years ago, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to bring Brexit into this. I should say, today I'm officially Irish. I came here on my Irish passport rather than my British one. So I'm kind of have a different perspective on this. When Douglas Carswell MP defected from the Conservative Party to UKIP, he took, and I'm using my words quite carefully here, he took his data with him. That is, he took the data that he had gathered while he was a Conservative MP over to UKIP when he defected. And questions were asked as to whether this was an ethical thing, a legal thing, and so on. And actually, when I put up a blog on a fairly popular political website, I got an email from Douglas Carswell basically threatening me with a libel suit within half an hour of my posting it up. But I teach libel law. I worded my thing very, very carefully. I did call it his data. So I wasn't accusing him of doing anything bad. All I was saying is that they were tempted. They liked it. And the UKIP people said they were rubbing their hands at the prospects of getting access to all this data. They thought it was good. They want this data. And then when I was looking at that, I looked at a couple of other things. I looked at the Labour Party, and I looked at how the Labour Party was offering an app which allowed you to check the electoral roll to see how many other people had exactly your name around the country. And it had the Labour Party in very small letters and little logo at the bottom of one of the pages, but basically it looked like an app that was generally good. I tried it with my eyes fairly wide open and found that there were 5 other people with my name, which was great. And in the next 3 weeks, I got at least 8 unsolicited emails from different people within the Labour Party, because they had gathered this data specifically to be able to target me. I'm not just going after Labour. I then looked at what happened with the Liberal Democrats, the nice ones, you know, the ones who don't like surveillance and things like that, and found that they had done a campaign against female genital mutilation and had actually gathered the names of the people who'd signed up for that campaign to use in their own political campaigning separately. So they like gathering data, they like profiling people directly from it, and they like to be able to target it as a result, and they use various relatively underhand ways of gathering it. So everybody likes data, everybody wants to use it, and they think they're being smart about it. Last point I want to make on this thing. When we look at political parties, it's fairly obvious. It's obvious that it's going to be done politically. So you can check the spending of political parties and so on. When you have people who are not quite so political, they might be an NGO, they might be just an individual who has an interest in subjects similar to the one that you're talking about. Can we draw a line and say this bit counts as political, so this data gathered is gathered for political purposes, and this bit of data is gathered for some other non-political purpose? And when I looked at the Lib Dems and their female genital mutilation stuff, is that political? Well, kind of not. And if you ban or restrict political spending without having some control over spending that is almost political, all you do is create a system that can be gamed. All you do is allow people to find a way to avoid the normal spending concerns. And anyone who follows American elections knows that this is a kind of has been standard practice for many years. Not just the official people, the unofficial people who do it and who get their data and use it. That's about gathering data. I'm not going to talk too much about the using of the data, but just to say, the stuff that we talk about here, though we talk about it in a political sense, is basically the same stuff we use for other purposes. So if we're looking at micro-targeting, it's the same tech for micro-targeting for political purposes as it is for advertising purposes. Yeah? It's the same tech that does big data analysis to determine trends and target ads and products as it is to determine trends of political opinions and so on. If we do not regulate, restrict, control advertising and related stuff, then we can't do the same for political stuff. If they develop tech for ads, that tech will be used for political purposes. If we want to protect against data being used badly for elections, we need to deal with the underlying infrastructure. We need to protect privacy. I mean, this conference is about privacy. We need actually to use data protection more strongly. And this is where the really bad bit comes in. And this is again an example from the UK. We have a new Data Protection Act, the Data Protection Act 2018, and the politicians carved out an exception for themselves to use data for political purposes. They carved out another exception for using data for the administration of immigration. They want to be able to use the data because they see the opportunity. We cannot leave it up to the politicians to decide how we're going to do this, because they will always think, we're the good guys, we need to use the data in the smart way. All we need to do is deal with the rogues, the bad guys on the outside. That will not solve any of our problems. Well, that's it from me.
Thanks, Paul. That was really interesting. I was wondering if I could push you a little bit more on the statement you made about can we draw lines? And maybe if you could talk a little bit about an approach to drawing lines or stakeholders. You said we can't trust the politicians. So who do you think should be involved in drawing these lines? And also, lines are context dependent. I mean, a line in the UK is going to be a very different line in India. And so, and at the same time, we have multinational companies playing very important roles in multiple contexts. So when we have this complexity, maybe you could delve a little bit deeper into what you mean by how do we draw lines?
I think in the international context, I could have spoken entirely about Facebook for the whole 10 minutes, but I decided specifically not to. I think that the drawing of lines, as you say, it's contextual, but I think to say it's contextual can sometimes be a kind of a get out for the people to be able to give themselves more leeway to do whatever they want. I think, well, it's interesting given who's sitting next to me. I think NGOs, I think civil society needs to play a much bigger part in it. I think that we somehow have to persuade politicians and civil servants to do more consultation with civil society, because that's the kind of the key civil society, and of course academia. Academics, we always like to get our oar in, but the politicians have their own self-interest at heart, and they've, at least in the UK, they've proven themselves unable to actually do so responsibly. Industry does not want to reduce its capabilities. You tell Facebook to deal with fake news, they deal with the symptoms, they don't deal with the underlying causes, the underlying problem of their data analytics and micro-targeting. They say, oh, we'll deal with some of these rogues and we'll find a better way to label it, and none of which actually deals with the bottom line. So I think the line drawing has to be done in consultation with particularly civil society.
Yeah, I would agree with you on that. We're going to move on to Ailidh. Ailidh Callander is with Privacy International, where she is responsible for PI's legal advocacy on data protection. She also leads PI's global legal research with PI's partners. And she'll be sharing insights on the Kenyan elections.
Thanks, Elonai. So, as someone who's worked in data protection law, we often talk about principles such as transparency, fairness, trust, accountability, and these are exactly the same principles that apply to elections. But as has been discussed during CPDP, currently data and elections are falling short on all of these principles. And thinking about data and elections is important in the campaigning context, but it's also important in the security context, whether it's thinking about the electoral register, the increasing use of biometric registration, and also the type of voting, and you have electronic voting. But at PI, we've looked at it from the profiling and the targeting perspective. Back in 2017, Privacy International investigated the use of data in campaigning in the Kenyan elections, including looking at the involvement of Cambridge Analytica. But ultimately, the investigation focused on the role of a Texan company called Harris Media, who has had other clients such as the AfD party in Germany and also Trump. And what they'd done there was work on a viral ad campaign in the lead up to the 2017 elections, which played on the volatile election environment. And this campaign specifically was using AdWords, and that was the method that was being used there for targeting. But there were a number of questions that it was extremely difficult to answer. And one of the issues in this context, for example, was that Kenyan does not have a data protection bill. There's currently a bill going through Parliament now, but at the time there was no data protection law. And that was just a snapshot into one campaign in one election, and there was a number of other issues which civil society looked into in that particular context. And in the last couple of years, the issue of profiling and targeting, micro-targeting, particularly in elections, has become ever more acute, pervasive. And it's been really important there, the work that Tactical Tech has done with various partners, illustrating what's happened in elections around the world in the last couple of years. But really building on something that Paul said, I mean, part of the issue that the tracking and profiling and targeting is so complicated, or perhaps we have so many questions, is it's ultimately tied up in the bigger infrastructure, the models of the platforms, ad tech, and data brokers. And these models can be tapped into by anyone with sufficient resources. And this is something that we've been focusing on in the past year, looking at a number of companies in the data broking, credit referencing, and ad tech industry. Because when you look at what these companies do in the sense of the small amount of data about you that they do reveal, and even what they say they do, compared to even, do we know the full extent of what they actually do? And you hold them up against the legal standards that we have, they fall short. And this, the way that they collect data, they rely heavily, for example, on electoral roll data. A number of these companies that we complained about, including Oracle, Experian, and Axiom, all are data providers for Facebook. So you have this underlying infrastructure, tools, and also these companies that are both gathering data, sharing data, and that's really what I think that we need to address. It's easier to point to problems than solutions, but I think that it is a start to try and use the legal frameworks that we already have. And I think that that's also, I think civil society has a role, but also regulators have a role in enforcing the laws that we do have. It is important to increase the transparency around the data collection and around profiling, but unpacking the kind of corporate data ecosystem is part of that, because we can't solely rely on half-hearted attempts by industry. If you think, for example, okay, on one hand you're saying, oh, we've got a transparency archive, we're signing on to a code of practice, but on the other we're going to restrict analysis of data and, for example, the use of transparency plugins that have been developed by civil society. It's not a matter of goodwill and leaving it to discretion, but rather looking to, I think one of the things is looking to the enforcement of the law. And so some of those core principles of data protection should be used and need to be enforced. And I think that it's encouraging that the scope of the ICO report in the UK was broad, but then, it's important to see what the next steps are going to be around the various actors, from the political parties, the data brokers, and then looking more systematically at the ad tech industry. So really this push to have the law enforced, both from a data protection perspective, but also looking at electoral roll and the role of the electoral commissions and having that joined up approach. And data protection isn't going to be a silver bullet. There's a number of issues. In particular, as Paul mentioned, these kind of carve-outs for political parties. There's one in the UK, but there's also examples in Romania and Spain. Data protection frameworks also tend to lack collective redress provisions, so it can be very hard to then actually get redress for individuals, and also for civil society to use these frameworks to take action. And regulators are often under-resourced. So these are a few of the issues there, but it is a start. So hopefully regulators can kind of get it together and at least address this issue of how the data is used, in conjunction with electoral authorities also getting the powers that they need, looking at the financing, and working together in that. So there's also issues in the sense of data protection isn't going to solve it, because there's not strong data protections all around the world either, but there are in a number of countries. And I think it's also important to be aware of data protection developments elsewhere. And so what is the lobby against those developments in other countries, where the safeguards would be important, and what can be done to have more enforcement there as well.
Thank you. I mean, I think a concern that we have is, at least in India, they don't have a data protection or comprehensive data protection legislation. right now. And so perhaps kind of like Kenya, these issues and concerns become augmented when we think about the different practices and the use of personal data that's happening in elections. And actually, you know, when you talked about the corporate data ecosystem, I had done the India report for Tactical Tech series, and when I tried to start looking into the companies that were involved and their practices, I found it very opaque and very hard to actually research. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about Privacy International's experience and maybe some of, just from a methods perspective, how you've gone about trying to find evidence and data around the corporate data ecosystem.
So I think that can be often a challenge, is the number of actors involved, and I think that was an interesting thing that we saw coming out of Cambridge Analytica, that the effort's gone to as well to disguise the linkage, for example, between entities. One of the tools that we used, and that is a right that everyone has, was, for example, the right of access. So your right to access your personal data, and asking these both the data brokers and the ad tech companies to provide data. It had mixed results, but some of the data was quite revealing. So, for example, the company Quantcast, which you may have encountered when you struggle to click through their consent management tool. It was very interesting to see there the way that they'd, for example, had the partner data, so you could see in their data the categories and segments that you'd been put into, for example, by Experian or Axiom or Oracle. But then it was often hard to get that data from those companies. So I think that that was something that we really felt was useful, was the access request, but they only went so far, and then that's, you know, for one individual. But sometimes the issue was, sometimes there's no shame either. You know, you read the privacy policy and it says one thing, and then you look at some marketing documentation and it says completely the opposite of what the privacy policy says. And I think that's an inherent tension, is a lot of these business models are based around the exploitation of data that is inherently in conflict with the legal framework. But I think, so it really depends what tools are going to be the best thing, because, for example, the access tool, but also it depends where companies are based. For example, the case that Ravi was talking about, that Professor Carroll was in the US, but because of where Cambridge Analytica was based, he could exercise his right to access, and that's been such an important, well, Ravi can talk more about it, but that's been really important there.
Thanks, Ailidh. Now we're going to move on to Victoria Peuvrelle. Victoria is with the Eticas Research and Consulting, focusing on various projects surrounding the protection of data and privacy, ranging from the use of algorithms, government, to data commons or bad data. And she will be sharing examples around data and elections in Catalonia.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me on the panel. My example today isn't completely about data, and it's not really about elections, so I'm tackling this from a slightly different angle. I'm going to talk about a slightly sensitive topic, I'll put it like that, the Catalonian independence referendum that occurred on the 1st of October 2017. Now, I'm not going to talk about what happened, because I don't really want to offend anyone or go into details about that. I'm just going to say this, that things happened that led to a referendum on the self-determination of Catalonia on the 1st of October 2017. Now, the police violence is something that has been widely covered in international media, as well as the flight of certain of the political actors and the incarceration of certain political actors. But what is less talked about, I'm going to talk about right now. So during the month leading to the referendum, Europe's first civil cyber war basically occurred in Spain. Starting on the 13th of September, the Spanish military police shut down the official website for the referendum, following a court order. Then, 10 days later, a court order ordered the blocking of all content by members of the government that was related to how to access the blocked content. Then, certain websites were ordered to be taken down, so internet providers were ordered to shut down certain websites, all in all about 140. The offices of the .cat registry were raided, and Google was asked to take down an app that told citizens where they could go and vote. And on the 30th of September, the military police occupied the Center for Telecommunications and Information Technology, blocking or suspending all information that could be used to facilitate the referendum, and detain a couple of its employees. This situation was denounced by internet-related rights organization outside of Spain and just globally denounced. And then on the other front, you had hacktivists that were putting up mirror sites for people to be able to access the information. You had information that was being passed through WhatsApp and Telegram because it couldn't be taken down. And there was some assistance from the Pirate Party. So you had two sides. You had the fight between the Spanish government and hacktivists and civil society on this other front. Then, on the day of the referendum, more things happened. So about half an hour before the voting stations opened, the Catalan government made a surprise announcement saying that a universal census would be used. So that meant that voters could vote anywhere in Catalonia and didn't have to go especially to their voting station. This was put in place to try to curtail the closing of certain polling stations by the police. And in order to make sure that people weren't voting twice, an app was created that could be used on all polling stations to check that you had not been logged on to another center. Now, very shortly after this announcement was made, about, I don't know, half an hour later, the Spanish government took down the app. And throughout the day, there was an intent to bring the app back online, but it was never managed for more than a few minutes at a time. So that meant that there was no way to check that people weren't voting more than once, which was a big point that was used to discredit the vote. Now, the data used for the universal census, well, the origin of where that data comes from is a bit of where does it come from? So there are two options to get the data. One is census data used for official elections that is handled by the Spanish National Institutes. And that is, but to get that, you need the approval of the Spanish Congress, the Prime Minister, and the King, which the Catalan government did not have. Another option was to use municipal registers used by city governments to track population figures. And this has no electoral weight, but it could be handed to the Catalan government if people's address were relevant. So that's what was thought to have been used, but we aren't sure yet. So on the 5th of December, the Catalan Statistics Institute was raided by the Spanish police in order to find out whether the data people's data were used for the universal census, and if so, then that would be an offense because the referendum was illegal. So that would be misappropriation of personal data. Now, there was a intermediary reports that said that there were strong suspicions that that was the data that has been used, but I haven't had more news since. But that's not it. Then we had a sort of catfight between the Spanish Data Protection Authority and the Catalan Data Protection Authority. The Spanish Data Protection Authority said that there is no legal basis for the use of registry data to create a census, and the Catalan agency answered that there was, and that in fact it had been used in 2014 for a consultation on the Catalan independence. Nevertheless, the Spanish DPA said that they would fine anyone participating in gathering data at the voting stations on the 1st of October could be fined up to 300,000 euros, which the Catalan DPA rejected, saying that the data controller in this case were not the people at the station, but the different electoral administrations. All of this happened, and so when I was asked to come on this panel, I was wondering, all right, we have data, we have the politicization of the use of data, but something that I didn't think would occur when I started researching this topic is that this catfight between the Spanish DPA and the Catalan DPA, because, I mean, I expect to be able to go to the DPA for an issue linked to data protection, but there's the politicization of data protection. So I'm bringing to the panel a problem. I have no solutions. I would love one. And the other problem that we can talk about is this cyber war that occurred. I mean, we're not talking about a violent movement. We're not talking about the dark net. We're not talking about we're talking about people that want self-determination. It's a very strong answer for that. So I think that's something that should be discussed too. Yeah, I don't have solutions. I'm sorry.
Okay, thank you. I won't ask you for solutions then. That's really interesting, and I think in some ways it shows just how elections are really bringing together and touch upon a number of very key policy areas that I think a lot of us work in: cybersecurity, privacy, intermediary liability, and online content regulation, which has been something interesting for me to kind of realize as I start exploring the use of data in elections. And actually, just a similar question for Ailidh. Could you talk a little bit about how you went about researching this? I mean, it sounds very complex, and actually that information was not straightforward, and you might have reached wrong information, and just maybe a little bit more about the process that you followed.
It's not easy because you can't really do it real time, because if you're finding a website that is a mirrored website, then it's probable that the Spanish government has found it too and has taken it down. So it's difficult to do it real time. And then when you do it after, the information you have access to is through the media. And media biasness was a real problem during the Catalan independence referendum. So it's just difficult to find information, first of all, that doesn't incriminate a side. And then it's difficult just to find plain facts, because different sources give different facts. So you don't know if it was 100 website, you don't know if it was 150, you don't know if it was this or that. You need to go through many different sources to try to get an idea of what happened. So, I mean, then there are other ways to go about it, but just in terms of if you want to go about it just through your computer, it's really difficult and quite frustrating.
Yeah, I can imagine. So now we'll move on to Claudio Agosti with tracking.exposed. Claudio is a self-taught hacker who, since the late 90s, has become a techno-political activist as technology has begun to interfere with society. His work has focused on visualizing the impact of algorithms over the perception of reality.
Despite I'm a self-taught hacker, apparently when I change the slide, they don't work. No, also the slide, because I see the slide here, but not there.
Got a mic here for you. Technical problems, sorry.
Thank you. Thank you. Let me test if this works. Great. Hello, thank you for having me. Well, the title is an international problem without international solution, but actually we're going to present an international solution. Let's see if it can work. My name is Claudio Agosti, and I want to talk about the project Alex, Algorithm-Exposed, and the first research output we produce, which is Facebook tracking.exposed. They both are dedicated in analyzing the effect of personalization algorithm, in the sense that nowadays information flow by algorithm that make you individual experience, and what we look are in fact timelines. This is a timelines is the sequence of posts of content that appear to an individual. Our first analysis is on Facebook, but we are also planning to study in other platforms. Why? This idea started nearly 2 years ago when the project began. The goal was to understand the impact that algorithm can have in distorting the perception of the public speech. We know that since 2013, this let's say infamous research experiment evidence of mass-scale emotion contagion through social networks was published by Facebook, and they were claiming and explaining how the experiment on an unaware individual, how to change their emotions. And this idea of using algorithm to influence or guide the society is not something so strange for Facebook, because also at the beginning of the last year, the blog post made by the company was about how they're changing the algorithm to bring people close together, to make surface more discussion that are meaningful for them. But who decides what is meaningful for me? So we, with our technology, we try to we want to enlarge the network of people that adopt this web extension. Is a technology that make a copy of the public post appearing on your timeline to let yourself do some self-assessment, and the researcher do analysis in the public interest. That is one of our claims. Don't delete Facebook, but give your profile to science, because every individual is a sort of unique observation point of the network. And that is a simple representation on how the collection looks like. At the end, the goal is getting evidence, getting metadata, getting some forensically valid copy of what is otherwise ephemeral. If I get informed or disinformed by a social network platform, the only way I can use to put this vision in discussion is sharing my mobile phone to a friend, or to talk about what I'm seeing, but it's not really practical. Instead, in this way, you can start to have metadata that get extracted by what is collected. And that can lead to interesting new use. For example, this is how 3 different people is in a Venn diagram, so every sphere represents what a person saw about a specific topic. In this case was a racist attack in Macerata last year. And as you see, the amount of keywords that were talking about this topic were quite a few in common. 2 of those users were getting quite a decent amount of information about, but the 3rd one was not. And this test has been made using 6 profiles that were accessing at the same time, scrolling automatically. They were following the same page, and the page were across all the political spectrum. This test has been made during the Italian electoral campaign of the last year, and this is an insight that after we tested in this condition, we want to replicate to let other people do their own Venn diagram and try to see how with their own partner, family, friends, colleagues, they are perceiving the debate differently. Because we advocate against the concept that an algorithm can tell you what is wrong, what is right, what is false, what is true. This is also a way to bring the discussion back between people, let's say. In the 2 years, we had interesting updates. We didn't offer yet services for individual. At the beginning, we made the tool stable for research. That's why we published some papers. At the beginning, the Lush Digital Fund has been the first one giving us some grant, then NLNet Foundation, but finally now we had from the European Research Council a more important grant that will permit us to bring this proof of concept to a product stage. Alex exists in the public interest, so we don't want to use the data of individual participating to exploit this data. That is exactly against our mandate and the ethos. It's also a free software project, and we are open to find contributors as the free software community in theory can support. But an interesting analogy we have to do is with a newspaper. Newspapers are known to be different between themselves. You know all of them. You may know all of them. You can understand that they describe a different political spectrum, and you can decide where you are. You can decide which newspaper you prefer more. At least is your agenda, your option, your decision. Instead, in the Facebook world, you cannot. It's like the algorithm is a sort of individual content curator, and you don't know which other editor can exist. You lack of this ability to see what happened outside of your personalized perception. Exactly with the newspaper, this is a quite complex graph that I will explain now, that show how the concept of filter bubble is not so simple. In the column, we have individual, so 6 different profiles that we were accessing through our labs at controlled variables. And on the row, you see media, Italian media, national media, Il Fatto Quotidiano, Il Giornale, Il Manifesto, La Repubblica. Every single row is about 1 day. So the first one in this slot is from the 8th of February, and then 9, 10, 11, 12. Now, in theory, the filter bubble concept say that if you are liking a content, you will see only that and not the other. And no, it's not so simple. Like in the case of the right-wing content, you see that the user of the right wing is getting a majority of from the media associated to their own content, to their own orientation. In the case of La Repubblica, center-left, this seems appearing to all the profile independently from who's the readers. And so also for this other media, Il Manifesto, which was publishing 10 times less, at least compared to La Repubblica, and still was present in all the timeline. So we can see that can exist some filter bubble, can exist some enforced diversity, but we have no agenda. Instead, giving to individual some agency is our goal. You can start also to run compared analysis and start to understand how a fair algorithm looks like. Because in this moment, we have no idea on what we want. We just know that this can lead to some problem, but in this case, we compared the kind of content that were appearing on the timeline. If it's text, so post, if are a picture or videos. So in the first profile, you see that the majority is of post. In the second profile, the same, 64 against 33 of pictures. The third, the same. And the fourth, Michele, the one that was oriented in the far right, is getting more picture than text. That is an indication. It's something that you can start to unaware on how are the algorithm working behind the scene. But at least you have some evidence to push for some data-driven policy making, to do some criticism to the black box of Facebook in a more accurate way. That for sure do not depend from Facebook, from data released by Facebook, but from data collected by an independent third party. So we published some research, and you can find our papers at this URL, and also with Tactical Tech, a blog post about the results on the Italian election, with the Web Foundation analysis in Argentina. But the point is, we are not researchers. We want to create a tool that enable other groups to do this analysis. So if you're a social scientist, the goal is reach to you, because we want to provide a stable technology for your need. And soon we were going to release a EU19 tracking.exposed, which is our website where we collect services offered for European citizens to monitor collectively the fairness of social networks in this European election. And one of the new target audience we want to cover is the candidate. Because if you're a candidate, such those two current vice prime minister, you can see that the green one, Salvini, was using Facebook much more than Luigi Di Maio. Well, you cannot see because the slide is cut in this display, but we can see. Anyway, the percentage is 88 compared to 11%. And you can expect that, again, if the algorithm is fair, the percentage is the same. If the algorithm polarize, you will have different... and that is how it looks like. So some profile have 50-50, other have reinforced their position, but when you are a candidate, you believe that to be disintermediated, but you are not. There is an algorithm in the middle. That's are the four kind of use case we want to follow, but my 10 minutes are finished. Keep watching on EU19.tracking.exposed, because we want to offer support for journalists that want to observe the phenomena outside of their bubble, for a social scientist, for individual, and that's all.
Do you want to keep
Thanks, Claudio. And I think it's great that this tool is trying to and can be used to create a body of evidence towards policymaking, because I think there's a gap right now in terms of evidence that policymakers can look to towards making informed, regulatory decisions around how to respond to social media platforms and other platforms and their online use of content. So in the upcoming 2019 elections in India, Facebook has committed to doing on-foot verification of political advertisers, and in an attempt to help protect and strengthen elections in India. And I guess my question to you is, what would you recommend Facebook do, based on the research that you've been doing and the evidence that's come from your tool? What kind of practices do you think Facebook can do towards ensuring fair and unbiased elections and content on its platform?
To be honest, I want Facebook do nothing, because this is an independent approach. We as a society should be able to understand what is the impact of social networks. And we should do it without that the company that want to protect their own digital, their own corporate interest is help us to keep them accountable. Of course, the Congress debate in the US has helped the Facebook to make a step toward transparency, but is that the best way? The best way is that we became digitally literate, we understand the impact of algorithm, and we can understand what we should demand to companies who treat our data and who personalize our perception. My long-term goal is that individual can retain their own agency, and so what Facebook can do is giving machine-readable format data and let people run their own algorithm. But that is so distant from the current situation that is not something realistic to ask for. So what we should do is just be critical and try to get data without asking the permission to Facebook, without getting their data to describe the issue, because we should analyze what is for us an issue, and we can do only through third-party observation in an independent way.
Thank you, and thank you to all the speakers. I think we'll go ahead and open it to the floor for questions now.
Have we got a mic? Have we got a mic for the audience? Oh yeah. Over at the back there in the center. And should we take two at a time? Yeah. Yeah? Do you want, after you have...
Thank you. Katarzyna Szymilewicz from Panoptykon. I really enjoyed the panel. Thank you for sharing insights. I wonder, do you have experience, any of you, with other transparency tools, working with Facebook or Google, especially those that engage individuals? How, whether you have experience in mobilizing individuals to give you data beyond what Claudio was just showing, or one of those tools that was blocked by Facebook, like Who Targets Me? I don't know actually why Facebook did it. I mean, I saw reports from civil society that it has been done, but I don't know the logic from Facebook. So also it would be interesting from anybody in the room knowing why Facebook actually did that.
We'll take a second question as well, and then get through a few more questions. Javier here at the front.
Hi, I have a couple of questions/comments, and one for Paul. I think you mentioned briefly the U.S. Anyone who's seen U.S. elections knows, that there is all this activity. And I think for me, something that I wonder is, before the internet, as such, before all this mass personalization, to what point the influence of how American elections are actually run and the level of personalized canvassing is actually driving this even before the data. I mean, I worked for a trade union, for an American trade union in Europe for a while. When they came in, they brought the American method of organizing, which was completely data-driven. It was a shock to the British trade union, when we started building our own data systems completely in parallel from the official union. The British Union would go to a factory and they will leaflet people outside. We will go to a factory and we will build a list of every single worker, up to 1,000 people one by one, by hand, by talking to people, and then we will have a conversation with every single person in the factory and grade them, whether they were hostile, neutral, or against the project that we were doing. And basically the guy, my boss, at the time, he went back to the US to work for the Obama campaign. And this kind of grassroots community organizing, I mean, has been completely data-driven for years, So in a way, I mean, the question is, what is the internet making different? And I think that obviously allows Russians to do this kind of thing, not only just community organizers, but I think that there is something, again, about not throwing the baby with the bathwater either, like in being able to do this quite targeted political campaigning, which is going to be necessary to fight fascism now as well. And the other thing, a small comment as well for Victoria, and I was working in Barcelona with some of your colleagues doing the digital strategy, at the time with Gemma. And one of the things we encountered, this thing about the relation between national identity and politics, so one of the things we found trying to build some sort of e-government authentication framework, that was going to be open source. It was who was going to be the source of data, and at the time what we encountered, and it was quite present, we knew that it was to do with the referendum, was the Generalitat already building a database to provide authentication services for e-government to all the local authorities, and there was a huge back-end battle, about who had that reference of the identity register. And it was the same issue that we found in Scotland when we went to work on some NHS register we're trying to build, and basically what we found is that the main driver for this was to be able to tax the Scottish people separately from the UK, basically to build up your own identity. And I think that the issue of building your national identity, something that is a huge, huge issue for any kind of independent movement. And when it comes to access, many of the most developed states, it's a kind of completely solid question, who is the population. But when it comes to new political formations, it's a huge issue. And in Catalonia, they had definitely been working on this for a long, long time. That was 2 years before the referendum, at least. Yeah.
Paul, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. Okay, I'll respond to Javier first. Just to say, I think it's important to understand that in the US, two things are different from everywhere else. One is the amount of money involved. At least until recently, there's been much more money spent on this. And the other is the role of commercial organizations within their systems. And in my, I'm sure everyone's familiar with the term astroturfing. I hope people are familiar with the idea that the term astroturfing. AstroTurf is fake grass. Astroturfing is creating a fake grassroots movement. What people may not be so familiar with is where the term actually comes from. And the person who coined it was Senator Lloyd Bentsen, who coined it in 1985. So we're talking really quite a long time ago. And this was in relation to the works of the tobacco lobby and the oil lobby. And what they did was basically seed local community events, town hall events and things like that with their own people, pretending to say there was a groundswell of opinion against banning smoking in public places or against putting greater taxes on petrol and so on. And they were able to do that because they put in a great deal of money into surveying the populations to work out where to go and so on. And that's because it was big oil and big tobacco were funding the stuff in there, but they also work very closely with the political campaigns. So in the old days, you needed a hell of a lot of money and you needed a very wide spread to be able to do all that. And I think what's changed now is that the infrastructure of the internet and the availability of the data and the extent to which we're all in the same place. I'm going to say we all. I'm not on Facebook, but frankly, most people are. You can get access to it much more easily. You can get much more detailed information, and then you can use it to target things. So you don't need to have people to send into these town halls to pretend to be locals. You can do it yourself automatically. So the technology has enabled the techniques that were developed in the 80s and earlier to be applied in the new situation more cheaply, more quickly, more effectively. I mean, they can do it better. AstroTurfing can be seen through, but it's much harder to see through online AstroTurfing than it is offline. But to do it, you need the data. You can't do any of this without the data. Transparency and transparency tools. I think these guys will say much more than me. I just want to raise a note of caution, and it's caution that I had. I always have on this. Transparency is a great tool for those who have the time, energy, and expertise to use it. It can also be a trap. Offer transparency, and you think you're giving people control and autonomy. If they don't have the ability to use the transparency in a way that's helpful to them, it's just a fig leaf. It doesn't help at all. So I'll be very interested to hear what people get from the real stuff, but I think we need to be aware it's a very incomplete tool to solve any of our problems at best.
So you would argue for usable transparency or something besides transparency?
I would argue for usable transparency, but also to know that transparency is only a small part of it. And frankly, Google and Facebook use transparency as a tool to reduce transparency, if you see what I mean. If you've tried to work through your way through their transparency reports and try to work out what it actually means, it sounds as if you're getting huge amounts of data, but you're actually no better informed at the end than you were to start with. To an extent. If you have the expertise, then what you need is somebody else to help you interpret the transparency reports, and then something to actually do about it. I mean, I spent so much time over the right to be forgotten stuff in Google, and how carefully they chose the examples to give of how it works, and how much resistance they put up to actually being transparent about how they create their transparency report is it makes me cautious of using it as a main tool.
An answer for Kasia. So, as far as I understand, Facebook has not technically blocked the ProPublica political ad collector and Who Targets Me extension, because the three web extensions of us, they all work in the same way. They do not depend on API, but they depend on passive collection and scraping of the HTML. And that's permit to don't depend on Facebook, but in the other sense, if Facebook change quite often their own HTML structure, this make harder for the technology behind to catch up and keep extracting metadata. So I made a way to be enough robust against those changings, but is a race. Instead, for the advertising, specifically for political advertising, which were the subject of investigation of ProPublica and Who Targets Me, Facebook start to be deceptive. So they write hiddenly in every post that post is a sponsored post. And then you cannot really know who is really the sponsor of the post. And that is a show how the conflict is not anymore the political one of blocking an extension and filing a complaint or ask for appealing, but it's technical. Indeed, what we can demand from Facebook is to don't at least be deceptive. If they don't want to help their data to be analyzed by third party, at least avoid to be deceptive in this way. But again, I guess this kind of agreement cannot be done simply, because it means regulating the HTML structure, and is something a bit far from the current discussions.
We got another answer. Does Victoria have an answer as well for Javier?
Just to add to that, I think that transparency tools are a really important part of the picture, but like Paul said, they can only be part of the picture. There's a good analysis, I think, by the New York School of Engineering, where they look at the different transparency archives and how helpful the ProPublica tool have been in bringing together to make a more concrete analysis. But I mean, one of the issues is then that's a really small percentage of people that are going to use that tool, and that bigger question, should the burden really be on the individual to have to look for this tool, get this tool, and that's where transparency is part of it, but there has to be a level of accountability at a wider level as well.
Yeah, Jonas from Germany, NGO. Thank you for all your presentations and discussions until now. Thank you, Claudio, for your splendid presentation now on your tool you developed. I'm super fascinated by it. There's only one point I didn't get right, I guess. You presented very interesting the point of Italian Facebook users who on the same point on narcismo and racismo, and that they see different things. But afterwards you showed that on a comparison with newspapers and so on, the filter bubble effect was not so great and big. So my question is, would you contest in general the theory of filter bubble? Would you diminish it and its effects on depending on the country, or what would you say? Because that's a real big point, and in my workshops I deal with that as well, and I would be glad on your clarifications.
Take another question.
David Odos from Cambridge University. Thank you very much for a really fascinating panel. Possibly my question is too broad to be useful, but going to the nature of the law, it seems to me, and it's just sort of for comments back, that the law is potentially rather confused. I mean, on the one hand, there's vast manipulation of data for political or promotion, purposes for the promotion of a political or social idea that people would consider unfair. On the other hand, our privacy laws stretch to prohibiting the email to somebody of marketing messages, which many data protection authorities, including the one in the UK, as Paul will know, interpret as the marketing, in inverted commas, of any political message, any charitable message, any aim for society, potentially, I suppose, even pointing out genocide and asking people to do something about it, which does actually impact freedom of expression enormously and can't possibly be, as far as I can see, compatible with the right to impart important ideas in society. And the fact that we're not having that, and to be fair, the ICO has successfully taken legal action against many political parties in the UK on that basis, and the tribunals have upheld their broad understanding, and yet the promotion of a political idea is absolutely integral to a democracy, and saying that you can't do it without someone's consent electronically, which is close to what we're getting to, seems very draconian to a democratic society. So what where do we go in this space? Because it seems that, you know, on the one hand, politicians will try and get away with whatever they want. On the other hand, the public really dislike politicians, and therefore they don't really care that they're being clobbered with certain legal rulings which maybe at bedrock don't make much sense.
We only have 5 minutes left, so big question to leave with you guys.
Mine is quite fast. So I guess filter bubble was a good, interesting concept in 2011 to explain how the information was flowing. Now it's not updated anymore. It's more complex than that, and there is also a psychological component. You tend to read what you can understand and appreciate. Sometimes I say that I am proud of my filter bubble because I took all my life to create my own experience to understand what is true and what is not, or what I can trust for and what I can put in discussion. So the point is how much an invisible tool can decide that something is not meaningful for you. That is more a political statement. Statement should not exist, and you should be in control of that. On the data showed, we were seeing that certain sources were appearing with certain percentage amount of posts, but we don't know about the content. In the racism, we make a query around a specific topic. That is a more qualitative analysis. Instead, in the quantitative analysis of media, that's just to show that the phenomena has not a simple answer. To be honest, it may deserve to be written a research paper that we start making all the false assumptions, all the terminology used, and why they're still okay, or how they can be explained better, and find new means to explain this information diversity or lack of thereof.
Paul, in 2 minutes, can you please give us an answer? I think that was the question for you.
Yeah, I'll try. So actually, I think the two subjects are linked in a way that may not be immediately obvious. I was writing about something that I called Backdoor Balkanization, and you can see why that didn't take people's imagination the way filter bubbles did. In 2010, I wasn't any good at the kind of marketing side of it. I think the point here is when you go back to the original Web 3.0 idea of the semantic web, where we sent out our intelligent agents to go and get information for us, and they would create the Daily Me for us according to our beliefs, according to our understanding. That sounds like autonomy. That sounds like we're doing it, we're in control, and that sounds like a good thing. Somebody else doing it to you, selecting it for you to try to manipulate you into their point of view, that sounds like a bad thing. And I think that it's understanding when one becomes the other, going back to what I said right at the beginning, is the challenging point. Do you understand the tools that you're being given, or are you being given tools that you're intended to misuse effectively, that they want you to? Because that's essentially what Facebook does all the time. They make it look as though you've got great control and granularity over your privacy and so on, but actually they're trying to push you into doing what makes you work best with Facebook. And we can talk about the emotional contagion experiment on that as well, because actually that's the key finding from that. So to get to David's point on this, the problem that privacy is supposed to solve is the problem of them doing it to you, not you doing it for yourself. It's them targeting you with information rather than you being able to access information. If you're in control of the process and you can find the stuff, then that sounds good, doesn't it? That sounds like this is the receive part of the freedom of expression thing. How we do that is another question entirely. And what I find it bothers me is when I get targeted with stuff based on them doing stuff to me I didn't want. What I like to do, and this is why I'm on Twitter rather than Facebook, is go out and get stuff that's being broadcast. We should never be stopping the broadcast in the same way that we stop the targeting stuff. That I think is the autonomy point for me. Maybe I'm a bit of an old Luddite in that way, because broadcast sounds like I'm going back to the 60s. But I think it is the question is of our autonomy in the process that for me is the key. Not really an answer, sorry.
We are running out of time. You're going to
Maybe-
get your answer anyway now, I think.
No, because I wanted to make a small point.
I think what we'll do is we'll let everyone summarise. So do you want to...
Yeah, we'll have closing, 1 minute closing, and perhaps in each closing statement, if you could say a research question or a research area or a data gap that you see in this or that you'd like to pursue, that'd be a way to close the panel.
I'm going to use my minute to answer David. That, I mean, it's a huge problem that has, there are so many things that go into it. The one I want to talk about is, well, if people cared more, then they would respond more to their data being used. And so transparency and accountability is something that should be tackled. And citizen participation, I think that together it would create a better ecosystem that would make it that at some point politicians would be called out for what they're doing and would have to stop at some point or risk losing followers. Yeah, that's my minute.
Thanks. No, I think on that point, we've not seen the political parties, for example, coming out and making any commitments to the way about the way they use data. We wrote, for example, to the UK political parties in light of the exemption. They did not respond to us. EDRI also wrote to European political parties. So it's political speech is very important. That's why it's protected. We have the rights to political participation, and these are essential. But the political actors have some responsibility here as well about the way that they're using people's data. So I think kind of in terms of kind of closing remarks, we're supposed to come up with solutions. We've obviously got a long way to go, but I think it's very much at the fore of many people's mind, and I think civil society is really trying to get on with this and think about that. And I mean, for me, I find it interesting the way that the legal frameworks we have already, whether it be data protection or electoral, to what extent they can offer some tools for accountability, and where did they fall short. But I think that's a starting point.
I won't say very much, less than a minute. I think we should seriously look at breaking up Facebook. And I mean that as a solution to almost all of this, actually, that we don't bite the bullet easily enough to say, actually, the underlying problem is the underlying infrastructure. Facebook's the poster child for that. We have to really seriously look at this idea.
I completely agree, but it's still a dream. And I also hope that Facebook will become ignorant about the data that is passing through the platform and letting more the agenda and the usability and the agency in the user side. But to do that, we need to be a strong society, informed and literate. And that is the first phase of our project. Do algorithm literacy using a moment of attention like the election, but also other reason can be the good one. Maybe is Cristiano Ronaldo versus Messi a reason to outreach to people different from us. Anyway, literacy, because if we want to regulate or keep this company accountable, we should know what we have to demand in our interest.
Thank you. I didn't do very well with keeping track of time here, because I was really into this conversation. I could keep this going for hours. But I will just summarise. We've heard from Paul about lines, creepy and political, from Ailidh about ecosystems and transnational hierarchies of justice, Victoria about cyber civil wars, from Claudio about tracking the trackers and data literacy. These are all amazing and interesting concepts about this massive problem that we have. We're all trying to get solutions. But if you'd all join me in thanking the panel for their time, and Elonai for moderating. Thank you very much.